Hello and welcome to the second event for Oxford University Linguistics Society Hilary Term. We are here with Professor Emma Borg, who is Professor and Head of the Philosophy Department at the University of Reading. She's also Director of the Reading Centre for Cognition Research and holds a major research fellowship from the Leverhulme Trust. We're very excited to be here with you and we're going to be talking about mainly semantic minimalism and your work in that.
Absolutely perfect. Can't wait, Mal. I should just say, though, for the record, I'm not head of department anymore, actually. I stepped down quite a long time ago now, so no, that's absolutely fine. Up to date on the pages, clearly.
All right, so to dive right into it, what is semantic minimalism and what exactly makes it minimal?
Okay, excellent question. So semantic minimalism, I kind of coined the term in order to describe what I take to be a sort of minimal job description for a semantic theory. So when I started studying semantics a long time ago now, it came to seem to me that no one was really being totally clear about what work they really wanted a semantic theory to be doing. So, you know, we could ask lots of things of a theory of meaning. We could want it to explain the communicative content that we get across when we talk to one another. We could maybe want it to do things like underpin our epistemology. You know, certain philosophers like Russell at one time thought that you could read off the contents of the world by looking at the language that you speak. So there are a sort of range of much richer tasks that you might want a semantic theory to do for you. And I try to argue that really we should have a very minimal job description in mind. Really, we should think that a semantic theory had done everything that it was supposed to do if it just provided someone with an understanding that allowed them to get at the literal meaning of the sentences they were presented with. And it allowed them to do that in a way that respected facts about the kind of inventiveness of language. So the fact that you managed to understand what I'm saying to you now, even though you may never have come across precisely this string of words put together in precisely this way before, that's something that a semantic theory ought to be able to explain, right? And you do that on the basis of pretty limited cognitive resources. You know, you probably haven't got an infinite list in your head that pairs all possible sentences with their meanings. So we need a theory that's going to do that kind of what Fodor and people have called compositional work. It has to explain how you get the meaning of a whole just from the meanings of the parts and the way that they're put together. And then I wanted to say if a semantic theory did that, then it was a successful semantic theory, even if it didn't do something like tell you what a speaker meant when they produced that utterance. And that distinction matters because, as we know from people like Grice, often what we say is not really what we mean, you know. So when I look out the window and say, oh, it's a lovely day and it's still snowing, you know, what I convey to you is not necessarily it's a lovely day. I may convey it's a horrible day. And that sort of worry is one that a lot of people have found very pressing, that idea that there's a distinction between the literal meaning of what you say or the literal meaning of your sentence and what you actually convey.
Fantastic. And that's actually a wonderful segue slightly into the area of pragmatics, which of course is not necessarily the literal sentence itself. So what role, if any, do you see for pragmatics and context?
Yeah, so on my kind of account, although it's minimalist on the semantic side, it's kind of maximalist on the pragmatic side. So a lot of the phenomena that people have sometimes wanted to explain from a semantic perspective, I actually think is better explained from a pragmatic side. So I'm happy with the idea that how we get at what a speaker conveys, so that kind of speaker meaning, actually really involves systematic, pragmatic understanding. And that can bring in everything that an agent knows, right from their knowledge of the meaning of the language, through to their knowledge of the background context, through to their knowledge of the individual and the kind of mental states they ascribe to the individual. So that sort of pragmatic interpretation is going to be a much richer kind of enterprise than just this sort of boring compositional semantics account. But a lot of the opponents of minimalism have found that a kind of unsatisfactory way of drawing the divide. And I think they've thought that for two reasons, or for two main arguments really. On the one hand, there are a set of kind of problems that are supposed to show that you just don't get anything like propositional content out of kind of sticking words together in syntactic forms. So there's a kind of incompleteness arguments, evidenced, I guess, by sentences like, you know, Jill is ready. A minimalist wants to say that there's a truth conditional content that you can get out of that, but someone with a more pragmatic leaning is going to say you just don't have a content there until you find out from the context what Jill's ready for. So that's kind of one set of worries from context, that you just don't get a content without a context. And then a second set of worries are to do with the kind of usefulness of content. You know, people think that what really matters is the pragmatically enhanced content, and kind of worse than that, why on earth do you need a literal meaning? These kind of thin minimalist contents. Perfectly respectable objection is to think they just don't do any work for us. You know, why would you want them? What we really want are the contents that are nicely responsive to context. So people on the contextualist side, those are the theorists who oppose my kind of semantic minimalism. They want to say, you know, you just can't treat pragmatics as this other kind of enterprise. It's absolutely bound up with getting at the kinds of contents that a semantic theory should be dealing with.
So how sharply do you think the distinction would need to be drawn then for minimalism to be viable? It seems like quite sharply.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really good question, I think. And I think minimalists would give you possibly different kinds of answers there, but I'll tell you what I think I would say. So one of the arguments that I tried to give in favor of minimalism right at the beginning was that it fits in with some other views that we might want to hold, particularly to do with the kind of cognitive architecture that underpins linguistic understanding. So I tried to suggest that there were good reasons to think that semantic understanding should be viewed as a modular activity. So that's the idea that you've got a kind of dedicated bit of the mind that is just kind of tailored for doing this kind of task, and it doesn't have access to everything you know. It just responds to certain kind of stimuli, does certain kinds of computational manipulations, and delivers a certain kind of output. And I said we've got a good reason to think semantics should be treated like that. But if it's right that there's a module underpinning it, then that makes it look different to kind of standard pragmatic reasoning, because standard pragmatic reasoning is that kind of all things considered type reasoning, you know, which thinks about the context, thinks about the encyclopedic information, thinks about other things the agent knows. So that's the way that I've taken the distinction between semantics and pragmatics to be kind of defined. I treat semantics as the stuff that happens inside the module and doesn't have that kind of breadth of appeal, and pragmatics to be this sort of generalized, abductive, inference to the best explanation kind of reasoning.
So again, you've almost preempted the next question, actually.
Sorry.
No, it's great. So with the semantic minimalism approach, does this mean that people don't have a perfect knowledge of their own language's semantics, or sort of the way it would fit into everything? How would we sort of think about people using the word water to refer to twin water, but not actual water, all of that?
Okay, excellent. I mean, so those are good questions, and I've recently got interested in thinking again. So you're kind of picking up there on the debate between more sort of internalist accounts of meaning maybe versus more externalist accounts. And minimalism, as I've construed it, is committed to a kind of semantic externalism, right? I've argued that you do have kind of propositional content or truth conditional content attaching to sentences, you know, just as they are, as it were. And that is in conflict with kind of semantic internalism, particularly as you find it recently in some really excellent works by Paul Petrovsky. So he's arguing very much that the account of content we want to give is one that's entirely restricted to kind of within the limits of an individual mind. And in a way that looks sort of attractive, given some of the things that I've said, okay, because if you want to think that semantic theory is to do with what happens in a module in the mind, you might start thinking, well, maybe the content should be those things in the mind as well. We shouldn't think of it as making contact with things beyond the agent, actual objects or states of affairs in the world. And that's very much what Petrovsky thinks. But I've tried to suggest that actually word meanings should be thought of as having this kind of referential content, as actually making contact with the world. And there are various arguments for that, but I guess the one that seems most compelling to me is really, and maybe this is just trading intuitions, I don't know, but really the idea that if you don't get the world into content in some way, then really all you're ever doing is a level of syntax. What you're talking about are the formal properties and the formal operations that you can do over symbols, and those symbols don't actually have genuine world invoking content. They're still things that require interpretation. And if you go down that route, then down the route of a kind of internalist account, then you still are going to have to give an account at some point of how those internal symbols map to the kind of world involving concepts that everybody agrees we really do think with. So in some ways you might think the internalist picture is just pushing the issue down the road a little bit. They've still got to say how concepts hook up with the world, and then they've got this additional problem about how the linguistic concepts, where those aren't world involving, hook up to these other concepts that we've got in the head. So I've tried to say that you can preserve this kind of externalist view even while you're doing semantic minimalism.
You mentioned word meaning there a moment ago. Where does the lexicon and its organization fit into all this? And what would minimal word meanings as opposed to propositional content look like?
Okay, so I've tried to say that the lexicon is something that's within the module, so it is something that the language system itself has appealed to, and lexical contents then will be minimal in the sense that they don't contain all of the information that an agent has about a topic. So this gets us into some quite delicate questions about the kind of theory of conceptual content or word meaning that we want to give. But if we look at the history of the debate, you can see different kinds of views. So if we think about a sort of inferential semantics view or a conceptual role semantics, on that sort of view, you have what I would call a really rich semantic content. So the way that things get content is by hooking up with all of these other concepts, and you get a kind of holism of meaning. So what it is for dog to mean what it does is, to have a description like has fur, barks, has four legs. And so this brings in all of these other concepts that you have, and the concept dog gets its meaning by standing in relation to all of these other concepts. I've tried to suggest that, or at least I've argued that minimalism shouldn't have a theory like that. Really, we want a referential notion where your concept refers to things in the world. So dogs refers to the property of being a dog, and you can find out things about dogs. You can find out that typically they have four legs, or some of them come in large sizes and some of them come in small sizes. But when you're finding that sort of thing out, you're finding out about the world. You're not finding out about the meaning of the term. So the meaning of the term is kind of non-complex, atomic, simple, and all of the other stuff you can find out about the reference then forms, it is information about the world, not about the language. And that kind of maps into an issue that's become very pressing in contemporary debates. So I think recently, one of the most interesting arguments that's come up on the sort of opposing side is thinking harder about this notion of polycymy. So polycymy comes about when an expression has two or more senses that seem intimately related. And you get at polycymy by often comparing it with homonymy. So homonymy is a case like bank, where riverbank and financial institution are two possible meanings for the word bank, but they seem unrelated and it's completely contingent that we have a single word for both of them. On the other hand, polycymy occurs around words like lamb, that can refer to both the animal or the meat, or a word like university that can refer to the institution or the individuals in it or the disciplines that it teaches, or a whole range of different kinds of reference. And there are different theories of polycymy that are on the table, but they kind of mirror this debate that we've just been having now about how simple or how complex word meanings should be. So one of the arguments in favour of the view I don't like, which is that word meanings have to be massively complex, is the idea that you can't get polysemy right without having these very complicated meanings, without having, you know, a full kind of conceptual content built into the meaning of the word. Kind of lost track of how I've got into this discussion of polysemy now, but I guess just to say that I think that that is one of the really interesting areas. So if people are thinking about topics to look at in philosophy of language at the moment, I think that whole polysemy debate is a really interesting one. And it's interesting to ask whether it really pushes us to require complex word meanings, or whether we can still do polysemy even with something simpler.
That's really interesting. I remember I looked a little bit at polysemy a few years ago and ended up getting quite confused, especially when looking in different languages and thinking, oh gosh, how do people work this out? It can be quite a mess. So the next question is about the analytic or synthetic distinction. And do you think anything that we've discussed so far commits us to something like this distinction?
Yeah, well, actually, that's a really good question. And actually, it's kind of leads me on to thinking a bit more about the polysemy issue that we've just been touching on, because I guess one of the ways you might think it comes up is thinking about how we understand polysemy. So on these kinds of counts that I've alluded to, where you think the way to understand polysemy is to have these rich conceptual structures, it looks like you may run into a worry because you're letting too much content. So, you know, let's think of an example here. We might want it to be the case that, I can't think of a good example on the fly. Well, take cat. You know, you might think that cat has a bunch of polysomous senses. You know, it can either mean the animal, it can mean the fur, it can mean the meat, and it can also mean sort of metaphorical senses like behaves like a cat. All of those seem okay as polysomous senses, but imagine that I've got a really idiosyncratic belief about cats. You know, I just happen to believe that cats are incredibly morose, you know, miserable, nasty creatures, much rather have a dog. If I then hear someone described as like a cat, I might get an interpretation that says, well, that person is really morose, but that doesn't seem like a legitimate polysomous sense for the term, because it's just to do with my kind of idiosyncratic beliefs about cats. So we need a way, if we're going to treat meaning as conceptual content, and we're going to think that it's this complex conceptual relations kind of picture, we're going to need a way to rule out idiosyncratic connections like that. And that mirrors very closely the kind of old debate between the analytic synthetic distinction. You know, what you want are the core inferences that are going to genuinely give you meaning, and you want to rule out these kinds of synthetic inferences that aren't constitutive of the content of the term. So I think actually one of the challenges for a good account of polysemy that goes down this rich conceptual route is that it's going to have to kind of rely on a pretty strong analytic synthetic distinction that, you know, we may worry about in the conceptual realm. So I think that these are all kind of debates actually about you know, internalism, externalism, analytic synthetic, all these kinds of notions that philosophers of language kind of put on the back burner a little bit in the last few years, where they've just been kind of obsessed by notions of context. I think these old sort of philosophical issues are probably going to come back, you know, back into focus again in the future.
So do you think, given what we've already said about it being semantics being a module of the mind and things, would it fit well into an individualist psychology, or is it going to need more than that?
Yeah, I mean, that's another good question. So I think one of the slight worries I have is making things too individualistic. So although I like this kind of cognitive slant on what we're doing when we're doing semantics, I also don't want it to become too much just about individual psychology. And we can kind of see that in response to the last question, that we don't want my idiosyncratic beliefs about cats to be the kinds of things that settle the meaning of the word cat. So I think we have to be cautious when we're trying to take this cognitive stance. And I think we can draw a distinction between different kinds of ways of appealing to the states of mind that we're interested in. So one way of thinking about states of mind is in a very concrete way. You know, what did that speaker have in her mind when she made that utterance? And that's definitely something you need to consider when you're trying to get at speaker meaning. You know, if you're trying to work out exactly, you know, what did Mal really mean when he just said that to me? I may really need to know about what Mal is thinking on this occasion. But I don't think that's the kind of notion of intention or mental state that we need when we're thinking about word meaning or about, you know, what's constitutive of a theory of language here. What we need to think about in that case is much more this sort of objective notion of intention, to do with what kinds of states of mind would a speaker typically have when they make this kind of utterance. So I think you can be a kind of cognitive philosopher of language. You can take this kind of mentalistic stance on what gives rise to meaning, but you shouldn't do it on the basis of what an individual has in their mind. You should think about typical states of mind for a member of that linguistic community producing that kind of sentence. So you get a kind of objectivity in, even though you're still thinking about mental states.
That's really interesting. And just to double check, does that link to your notion that you've discussed about mind reading? Is that also to do with that distinction of the individual versus sort of the group?
Yeah, kind of, I think. So my current research project is very much thinking about mind reading. I've got really interested in this idea of whether we need to see each other through the kind of lens of mental state attribution, or whether there's something else going on when we're trying to understand one another. So there have been a bunch of kind of arguments recently that, you know, we don't really need to worry about abstract things like beliefs and desires, these kind of, you know, quite complex, difficult to access kind of states. Really what we should be thinking about is maybe just, you know, a kind of responsiveness to the behavior that an individual displays in a given context, where that behavior is understood in quite kind of, you know, brute, materialistic kind of terms about what they're doing with their limbs and what objects there are in their environment and what affordances those objects have. And maybe we could do everything we want to do about prediction and understanding just on the basis of those kinds of much lower level cues. But in the current project, I'm trying to argue that that's a mistake, that even though it's right to think that we do need to pay attention to these lower level cues, that we do often show a really impressive level of sensitivity just to behavior plus context, that actually understanding one another is more than just that kind of sensitivity to actions. It really does require positing mental states of the other person. And why that seemed problematic to people, I think, is that sometimes positing of mental states looks kind of complex or difficult or slow and reflective and conscious, and clearly our understanding of each other often doesn't have any of those properties, right? It's often quick and automatic and subconscious, but I don't think any of those properties add up to an argument for it not being premised on mental state attribution. And I guess that ties up a little bit to this question of individualistic versus kind of, you know, based on a community or wider, because I do want to look at, you know, general claims about the way in which we understand each other rather than the particular individualistic claim, I guess.
So I suppose this ties in with this question, which does go back a bit. Next week, we're actually going to be speaking to Professor Paul Petrosky. So if you could say a little bit more about how minimalism might relate to internalism. I know one thing you've been keen to do is say that minimalism isn't committed to internalism, but rather externalism. And why would people make the connection between minimalism and internalism in the first place? Okay,
really good question. I'll see if I can construct my thoughts here. And say hi to Paul when you see him. So I think, you know, I think a reason it might come up in the first place is that one that we touched on a moment ago, which is that kind of prima facie, minimalism and internalism seem, you know, a bit like a match made in heaven, because what minimalism tries to tell you is everything that you need to do for understanding the strict and literal meaning of a sentence is to be found in the head. You know, it's about a module, and it's about the operations of the module, and just, you know, sticking bits together in nice syntactic structures and working out what the meaning is, you know, given just those features. And that can make you think that it's a very kind of internalist enterprise, right? I'm just talking about stuff that's going on in here, in the mind. Doesn't really matter what's going on in the world at all. And I think that's right to an extent. You know, it is right to think that there's a form of kind of view around here which is much more internalist than the one that I've argued for, which would hang on to these ideas about what the role of a semantic theory was, but wouldn't be committed to this kind of externalism about content that I've, you know, held on to. So why do I think that's not the position that I want to go to? Why do I want to think that minimalism is actually more committed to externalism than that? Well, I guess it's for two reasons. One is worries that I have for the internalist model itself, and the other one is arguments to do with what minimalism can do for us. So I guess to think about the second one, at least initially, you know, I mentioned that there were two objections that could be, two kinds of objection that could be made to minimalism. One is that minimal contents just don't exist because there are some sentences that lack kind of propositional content. That's obviously going to fall out the window if you have an internalist view anyway, because you don't think semantics is in the business of delivering truth conditions. So that would be a good thing, I guess. But the other objection here was that minimal contents don't really do any work for us. Why do we want to claim that sentences have these truth conditional meanings when, you know, they don't do anything? It's really the speaker meaning we're interested in. And I guess it's that objection that internalism is really pressing on, right? It's saying semantic contents do everything we need without invoking truth conditions, so we don't need these kinds of minimalist truth conditional contents around. And I think the answer to that challenge is that that just doesn't seem right to me. You know, it just seems to me that there are things that we do, practices that we engage in as ordinary language users, that you can't capture on that kind of internalist picture. So actually that comes out a bit in a paper that I wrote quite recently, investigating what I call different kinds of linguistic liability. So I think that we have this practice of taking speakers responsible or culpable for the things that they say, but we have quite different practices about liability. So we have a notion of kind of strict liability, where we take people just to be responsible for what they literally said, you know, the actual contents of their words, and they're responsible, you know, that's a binary notion. Either what they said, literally said, is true or it's false. And then we have a second kind of notion of liability, which is much more graded, much more flexible, where we take people to be responsible for the contents that they communicated. And that's a matter of degree. So you might think that someone who says, you know, there's milk in the fridge. This is a famous case from Charles Travis. He says, imagine someone who says there's milk in the fridge, and they're talking about a fridge that doesn't have any bottles of milk in, it just has a little puddle of milk on one of the shelves. And Travis's point is that sometimes that utterance seems true and sometimes it seems false, depending on the purpose of the conversation that we're engaged in. But what I want to point out here is that we have different senses of liability relating to the different kinds of contents we might have in play here. So I think we take someone strictly liable when they say something like there's milk in the fridge for just that claim. It's, you know, what they've said is true if there's milk in any form in the fridge and it's false otherwise. And then we have this kind of conversational liability where the content judged is something like there's milk in the fridge, suitable for a form for making tea or something. And then we might take them as pretty responsible for having said that there's milk in the fridge in a form, you know, fine for making tea. Maybe a bit less responsible for having asserted that there's milk in a bottle in the fridge, because maybe it's just in a jug, you know. And then we can have this whole range of contents where we can have a discussion about, well, were they did they really communicate that, or did they not communicate that? So I think conversational liability becomes this much more nuanced kind of conversational notion, but that doesn't detract from the fact that we have this absolutely strict notion of liability where we can just assess, they said there's milk in the fridge. Is there milk in the fridge in any form? Yes, there is. So what they said was true. No, there isn't. So what they said was false. And sometimes we need that notion of strict liability, in contexts like the law, or maybe in textbooks, or range of different kinds of conversational settings. We use that notion of strict liability. You can get speakers who are obstructive or difficult, and they always try and go for that more kind of literal kind of reading, or at least in some settings they go for that. And I think what those practices show is that we just do, as ordinary speakers, have this notion of exactly what your words commit you to. And you only get that really, I think, with this externalist version of minimalism. So that would be a kind of positive reason for thinking that a truth conditional account is better than an internalist account.
That's absolutely fascinating. Listening to that, the liability with regards to milk, I think, gosh, this sounds like the beginning of an argument I'd have with someone. You said this, no, I didn't say that, well, you did. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. I'm sure everybody listening will be able to read into that and think, I've done that. I've been part of that kind of conversation. So one other question that we have for you, which is on a slightly newer side of where you're focusing, is your new project about folk psychology, reason and rationality. And we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this, what this relates to, and indeed whether it relates to any of your previous projects in semantics.
Okay, so I can do my best. I should say I only started the project in October, so
well, whatever you can share would be great.
Thank you. I feel like it's still working itself out, but I guess I got interested in this, so it definitely stems from work in semantics, because particularly in my first book on minimal semantics, I was trying to make the case that, there were these newer kinds of arguments against truth conditional semantics that came from contextualists like Recanati and Travis, and these were really interesting kinds of arguments, but they didn't seem to me nearly as problematic as the kind of old school argument against truth conditional semantics that comes from standard context sensitive expressions. So we all know that in natural languages we have expressions like I and this and that and today and tomorrow, and they seem to depend for their meaning on a really inherent kind of way on what the speaker intends. So when I say you are F, it really matters who I'm intending to refer to with my use of you. And that looks kind of problematic, particularly going back if you have this kind of modular view of what underpins semantics, because it looks like, I'm saying it all happens within a module, but I'm also saying you're going to need to look to speaker intentions in order to work out what the speaker meant when they said you, and those two positions seem in conflict with one another. So I think that's where my interest in how we understand one another's actions and how we access one another's thoughts came about. So it kind of stems out of that project. But then, as I said, I got kind of interested in this wider question about whether we really do go about understanding one another in terms of mental states at all, or maybe we just do it, maybe we understand one another in more basic, maybe behavioural terms. So that's where this notion of thinking about kind of deflationary accounts of theory of mind have come up. But then in addition, in the project that I'm doing at the moment, I've become very interested in this question about whether we can think of each other as being broadly rational or not. So, back in the day when folk psychology kind of first burst onto the scene, it seemed unproblematic to think that what somebody does is the result of their mental states. It's the result of the things that maybe they believe and they want and they, decide. So, why do I go to the cupboard? Because I want a biscuit and I think there's a biscuit in the cupboard. That seemed an absolutely unproblematic way of explaining what I was going to get up to. But that sort of picture has come under threat from a range of different positions. And in particular, it's come under threat from some work in social psychology that says a lot of the time what we're doing is not the result of what we believe and desire. We're actually being kind of blown about by all of these kind of potentially irrelevant features of a situation, and we don't even know that. So in work by people like Kahneman and Tversky and the behavioral economics kind of school of thought, what we're doing is the result of things like what's cognitively available to us, or what kind of associations we have between our concepts where we don't even realize that those are associations that we hold. And so any kind of attempt to explain what we're doing in old-fashioned folk psychology terms is going to be doomed to failure. So I'm going to say that, I don't know, say I'm trying to predict what you're going to do in the lunch queue, Selena. And I think, oh, well, I know Selena's, she worries about, she's concerned about her health and she'll want to choose the healthy option at lunch. So I predict that she's going to pick the fruit for pudding rather than the chocolate bar. And it turns out that you do pick the fruit. And so, thumbs up, I get you exactly right. And that's really good. It's been a successful account of kind of mind reading. But what the behavioral economics people are going to want to say is, well, no, it's right that you picked the fruit, but actually it turns out that's not because you were thinking I'm going to have the healthy option, but just because, unbeknownst to you, you have a preference for picking objects that are presented in the middle row of an aisle display and not at the bottom. So maybe you didn't pick it because it was the healthy option, you picked it just because it was in the middle shelf. And if that's right, then even though I got my prediction of you right on this context, if I try and do the same thing again when we're in the lunch queue tomorrow and they've switched the apples and the chocolate bars around, I'm going to go wrong because now you're just going to pick the chocolate bar because it's in the middle. So in this book that I'm going to try and write, I'm wondering whether that is really right, whether the results are really robust, and what that tells us about A, how rational we are, and B, how we go about understanding one another. And the conclusion that I hope I'm going to reach, that I feel like I'm going to reach at the moment, is that claims about our lack of rationality have just been a bit overblown and gone a bit too quick. And in fact, we're more rational than the sort of behavioral economic stuff gives us credit for. And in part, actually, that comes back to philosophy of language, because I think in a lot of these cases, where they're linguistic cases, the theorists have very much overlooked stuff that's very familiar to philosophers of language or to linguists, right? So, we started this debate by thinking about what's the relationship between meaning and context. And a lot of the examples that are used in the behavioral economics literature totally miss what kind of information a participant might be getting from the contextual setting. So just to give you a quick example, if you want one, there's a really kind of famous case where we're supposed to be prone to a conjunction fallacy, because I give you a description of Linda, which tells you something like, Linda is, she works in a bank, and she's a bank teller, and she's active in feminist issues, and she goes on marches, and she's campaigned for nuclear disarmament and other kinds of things. And then you have two statements and you ask people which is more likely, and you say, is it more likely that Linda is a bank teller, or is it more likely that she's a bank teller and a feminist? Which answer would you guys give?
I'm the wrong person to ask. I've read the book.
Well, I haven't, and I don't know if I'm going to mess this up now. I'd probably say a bank teller and a feminist, based on what you said.
Absolutely right. So that's the answer that everybody gives. So you're fine. But the suggestion is that shows us to be systematically irrational, because we know from logic that a conjunction of A and B can never be more likely than either just A on its own or B on its own. Because, obviously when you put two things together, there's double the chance for things to go wrong. So, the conjunction can never be more likely than one of its conjuncts. So what Kahneman tells us is that, we're being irrational here. That's our kind of fast system one, just, not paying attention properly. But, if you're a philosopher of language or a linguist, you should be up in arms at that moment and saying that is not in any way irrational, because what we're designed to do is to make sense of what our interlocutor is saying to us. And our interlocutor has gone to a lot of effort in this case to present evidence that's relevant to Linda being a feminist. So, the question you would be asking yourself there is, why would this person bother telling me all this stuff if they're just trying to tell me Linda's a bank teller? So in that case, I want to say, you know, the result is right. People do think it's more likely that Linda is a bank teller and a feminist, but that's because of the nature of communication. And if we had a bit more kind of nuanced background from our philosophy of language, then we would have been more resistant to the claim of irrationality there. So I guess it connects in that way, and it connects into this general interest in how we understand one another, both linguistically and non-linguistically, I think.
All right, that's I think that's the end of our questions. It's been
excellent,
really, really fascinating, and thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed talking to you in these days of kind of remote video conferencing. It's very nice to get a chance to talk philosophy with people, so thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. Thank you.